Facebook or YouTube or however you're doing. We've got about close to 30 people here in the classroom this morning, which is about what we thought that we would have. And just bear with us. This is going to be a little bit of a learning experience for us this morning as we try something new, but it's good to be back in the Sunday school class. It's good to be standing up teaching. It's good not to be looking at a computer screen and looking at notes and trying to watch faces. And the disadvantage of this is with Zoom, I can kind of tell who's out there. This morning I have no clue. So we were joking before the class started, before Dennis started the live stream, that we hope nobody from the government was out there. We'll have to try to be careful what we say this morning. So anyway, good to be back in Sunday school this morning. Just a couple of things to mention. Our class fund is doing well. We've got a little offering plate up here for those of you who are watching live stream. If you'd like to make a contribution, you can send it into the church and just earmark it. We've got about $1,400, which is more than enough to do what we had planned to do for our first responders thing, which is going to be the 19th. So this week we'll firm up our plans for that. And some of you folks have been good enough to volunteer to help with that. And we'll, like I said, hopefully by the end of the week we'll have our plans buttoned up. Larry's out of town, and so he has the contacts with the first responders. So when he gets back Tuesday, we can start planning some. The lesson this morning that we're in is found in Esther chapter 5 and 6. We have this lesson this morning and then one more from our series that covers the books of the Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah, and now finally Esther. This is the third of four lessons that come from the book of Esther. And of course, Esther, the story of Esther is an incredible story that I just absolutely love. I enjoyed teaching the last lesson. I've enjoyed studying for this lesson. The problem that I have with it is sometimes I get caught up in the story rather than the meaning. And it is, y'all know we've joked forever about how much I like Hallmark movies and love stories, and I like mysteries, and this one's got all the intrigue, the palace intrigue, and drama, and a villain, and everything, but there's a deep meaning for the story, and we need to make sure we don't lose sight of that. The book of Esther is really familiar to most, if not all of us. We won't take a whole lot of time reviewing the last two lessons this morning, but because it's a story, we do kind of need to set the stage for the lesson today. In the first lesson, we were introduced to King Ahasuerus. I like listening to Larry Smith try to say Ahasuerus and Xerxes. He struggles with them, and I struggle with them too. But the thing I like about this story is there's so much of it that you can corroborate in secular history. We know that Ahasuerus that was mentioned is really King Xerxes, who was the father of Artaxerxes, who Nehemiah would later serve and go back to Jerusalem. Through a not so brilliant series of events on Xerxes' part, he ends up without a queen. If you remember the story, he had said they had this big party. It was actually the end of a 6-month-long party. He sent for Queen Vashti to come and basically show her off, and she said no, and they end up deciding that she can't be queen anymore, largely in part the fact that she had embarrassed them, and they felt like that would reverberate through to and cause a problem for men all throughout the kingdom. So they remove her from her job, and after some time passes, actually it's thought to be a period of a couple of years or more, some time passes, they come up with a plan to find a new queen. And that's where this, what we'll call a beauty contest, came from, that resulted in Esther coming to the throne. Esther, as we talked about, is the cousin of Mordecai, who had actually raised her as his own daughter after the death of her parents. So she was an orphan. Mordecai takes her in. And as a result of Esther becoming a queen, it's thought that we know that Mordecai got a new position. He's now sitting in the king's gate. He's one of the officials, if you will, of King Ahasuerus' government. He's sitting in the king's gate. Last week's lesson, we were introduced to the villain. He's the guy wearing the black clothes and the black hat. And story about a man named Haman. And Haman was a man that Xerxes had promoted. Of course, there's a deep history there with Haman as well. He was the son of Hamadatha, I think is the name, who was actually, his name was Hamadatha the Agagite. So there was actually a connection to King Agag, who Saul had been destroyed, been commanded to destroy all of, and he didn't do that. So there's still this whole thing going on there. But along with the promotion from Haman, he promoted Haman to the position of prime minister of the country. Basically, he was second in command, if you will. But along with that promotion came a commandment from Xerxes that all the king's servants would bow down to Haman. And they all did, with the exception of Mordecai. Mordecai refused to bow down. So obviously we know that didn't set well with Haman. Haman has a problem that a lot of us have. When I say this, you'll smile and probably grimace a little bit, because we all do it. Haman was in love with Haman. We're all in love with ourselves a little bit, aren't we? But it seems to be that Haman, was in love with himself on steroids. He took it to a much greater level than maybe most do. So Haman was so incensed by Mordecai's lack of respect that he comes up with this plan. He proposes a plan not just to destroy Mordecai, but all of the Jews throughout all of Xerxes' kingdom. It's interesting that he failed, and we'll talk about it later. He apparently did not identify who it was to Xerxes. We'll talk about that more in detail in just a little bit. Apparently, Xerxes trusted Haman so much that he gives him his ring, which was the ring that he would do the seal, and basically told Haman to go and do what he pleased. He could go and write that edict. So Haman sends out this edict that basically, it's kind of odd, the way it worked out, but he sends out this edict that in 11 months, all the Jews, are to be utterly destroyed. And the people of the kingdom were the one that were going to do it, and the incentive for them was that they got to keep the spoils. You kill the Jews and you get to keep their stuff. And so obviously you've got this whole people. They're scattered all throughout the kingdom. Some are back in Jerusalem already. Some in Shushan Palace. They're scattered all over, and all of them everywhere are to be put to death. So Mordecai hears about it. Obviously, he hears the edict. They send it out. Within a couple of days, it's all throughout the kingdom. Mordecai goes in the morning and he puts on sackcloth and ashes. Esther was apparently insulated from this. Maybe she was not aware of it. But she hears about Mordecai in his mourning. And she apparently had no idea why, so she sends a messenger to Mordecai. And, through that messenger, she learns of the plot. And last week, Larry covered it. That Mordecai's appeal to Esther was simple. He asked her to go into the king and to plead with him on the behalf of her people. In addition, to his request, he says two other things to Esther. He tells her basically that she won't be spared. In other words, don't think that you're going to escape this, even though it was apparently still a secret at that time that she was a Jew. He says, don't think you're going to escape it. And he says this other statement that was actually the title of the lesson last week. It says, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So, even though God's not mentioned, Mordecai, basically insinuates here, and I think rightly so, that maybe you're here because God put you here because of what's about to happen. So we remember, Esther's response. She says she'll do it, but with conditions. You remember what the conditions were?
They would pray.
They were to pray and do what else? Fast. For how long? 3 days. They were to fast. It's not just that they were to not eat. They were not to drink either for 3 days. That's pretty serious stuff there. I mean, that's, I occasionally will attempt to fast, and I can make it through a day without eating. I drink more heavily on those things. I just do. But, I'm not to make light of it. To make a commitment to not eat or drink for 3 days, you got to be serious about something, don't you? And you really do. And Esther wasn't saying y'all do it. She did it herself, and she did it herself, and along with her maidens. And after the 3 days, she would go in to the king. So that's where we pick up the story today. We're going to be in Esther, chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 1. We're going to see what happens. Starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal thrones in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. We just talked about the fact that she had been fasting and not drinking, and by implication praying for 3 days before she goes into this, she makes this move. I don't think we can fully appreciate the courage that it took for her to do it. I mean, it's not, we think about, okay, the queen wants to go see the king, but that ain't the way it was. This is not an ordinary king-queen relationship. I think she fully expected to die. She fully expected to be rejected, and if she's rejected, she would be put to death. For her to go into the king without being invited as was required was just something that did not happen. There was in some of the things that I studied, and I studied so much of things, facts and things seem to run together, but archaeologists seem to have been able to uncover and determine that there was actually an armed servant of the king there with an axe that was ready to behead anybody that the king rejected, put to death. So it was a real thing. I think it's interesting that Jewish scholars, and I'm giving you some homework this morning, Jewish scholars later on, when they're translating the Hebrew into the Greek Septuagint, I believe it's called, Pastor Paul, they had trouble believing the story too, that it was so easy, it was such an easy thing that Esther was able to just walk in and the king would drop the scepter and she'd be accepted. So they actually embellished it and added verses when they translated it, because they just could not believe it. And so they dramatized the story. I challenge you to go home and Google Greek Septuagint for Esther chapter 5 and read it and let me know what you think. It's really like a Hallmark story. I mean, it really, really is. And she faints into his arms and all this kind of stuff. And that was the Jewish scholars that did that. So anyway, obviously, King Ahasuerus holds the scepter out, which was court procedure for telling her to come. And she's welcome in the king's presence. Can you imagine the relief that must have gone through Esther at that point in time? I'm not going to die, at least not right now anyway. So, not only did the king not have her killed, look at verse 3. Look how well she was received. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. To the half of the kingdom. That's pretty good. I think Ahasuerus must have realized. And you remember what Esther told Mordecai back when they were communicating back and forth? He said, the king hadn't asked for me to come these 30 days. It's like, I hadn't been in there in a while. So it's thought that maybe the king realized what a risk that she had taken by coming uninvited. And so his response basically was, whatever you need, just name it. Look at what happened next. Verse 4. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. For a fellow that was willing to do essentially anything that Esther had asked, you wonder if he always said to himself, you risk your life to come here and ask me to come to a banquet? You would think, and so he obviously realized that there was more to it than just coming to a banquet. So when they get there, he has Haman hurry, and they arrive. The king's waiting for him. So he presses her. Look at verse 6. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom, it shall be performed. In essence, what he's saying there is, I know you didn't just ask me to come just to a banquet. Look at what Esther says in verse 7 and 8. And answered Esther and said, My petition, my request is, I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Does that strike you as a strange response? She risked her life, to come and make a petition. The petition is come to a banquet. He presses her, and her petition is, come to one tomorrow. It just strikes me as funny. For 3 days, she's gone without food or water as a fast. Undoubtedly, she prayed fervently, and she's got the king and Haman alone together to tell the king what was really on her heart. And here's what she comes out with. Can you both come to another banquet tomorrow, and I'll tell you what I really want. You know what she just did? She just risked the king's anger once again. You got to understand, one of the problems with the king, with interrupting the king unannounced, was, he was basically, there was 2 superpowers in the world at the time, and, I'm sure he's on a schedule, he's got people wanting to see him. So now he's agreed to come, for this one banquet, and now your next request is, we'll come to another one tomorrow. He probably, she probably ran the risk of making him mad again, but the king had already agreed. He'd already boxed himself in by saying, whatever you want up to the half of the kingdom, I'll give it to you. One of the commentators that I read made this statement. He says it's worthwhile to note here, and I'm saying this is him because I don't want to be associated with the statement. It's worthwhile to note here that for centuries, wives have been getting their husbands to agree to do what they want them to do before they even know what it is. My wife is better than that. She makes me think it's my idea. So, there's some differing opinions on what's actually going on in Esther's mind, and they're probably all right to one degree or another. Some commentators believe that Esther simply choked. She was just too afraid to come out with it. Can you see how that might be the case? I can. Because now she's gotten past this one hurdle. Now here's the next hurdle, which she's about to tell the king that his prime minister is a scoundrel, and she just may have just choked. It would certainly be understandable, and there may have been an element of that in it. But regardless of whatever Esther's, was in her heart and her emotions, there was something much bigger than that. Warren Wiersbe, his commentary makes 4 points. First, he says it wasn't the right time. And if you stop and think about it, what? There was this banquet. There were probably servers there. She needed a time when it was just she and Haman and the king there, just the 3 of them. It was also probably not the right time from the aspect of he wasn't prepared yet to hear that his prime minister was such a scoundrel. The other thing is Esther wanted Haman and Haman only present because she thought that Haman's pride would cause him to do something stupid to incriminate himself. And as it turns out, that happened. And the 4th reason Esther is probably not even aware of herself for the time, one more event has to happen. All the things have not fallen into place that need to happen. But God was aware of what those were because He's going to orchestrate that. Let's look at what happens next, starting in verse 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood up, nor that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king into the banquet that she had prepared, but myself, and tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Haman is on cloud nine. For somebody that loves himself, life is good right now. It's really good. He's one of those people, and we all know him, and maybe we're guilty of it sometimes ourselves, that Haman's favorite topic of conversation is Haman. Haman likes to talk about Haman. And so he's telling them all the things. He talks about his wealth and about how many children or sons that he had, and his promotion, and how all the other princes and leaders in Xerxes' service, they all have to bow down to him. And now he's reached another pinnacle. He's in the inner circle. He's actually reached a personal level in that he's now dining with the king and the queen. Not only that, he's going to do it again tomorrow. Life is good. Stephen Davey says this. He says that Haman is one big, gigantic hot air balloon. Self-conceited, self-promoting, self-applauding, and self-absorbed. He's going on and on about how great his life is, and all that he has, and how wonderful it is. But there's one thing. In spite of everything that he has and all the good things that Haman's got going for him, he's not happy. Look at verse 13. This is what Haman says. He says, yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He's got it all. He's second in command. He's wealthy. His life is good. He's got everything going for him. But yet there's just one thing. He can't be happy because of this one thing. Isn't that human nature for us too? We can have so much good in the one thing. We'll have one thing. And the problem is we tend to make that one thing, sometimes insignificant things, overshadow all the good in our life. And that's exactly what Haman was doing. He got everything going good. He's got one Jew in the whole kingdom that won't bow down to him. And he's about to make him a crazy man because of this one thing. He reminds you of King Ahab. You remember King Ahab? Remember King Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. King Ahab had a ton of vineyards. Yet he goes out and he tries to buy this one vineyard from Naboth. And Naboth says, sorry, it's not for sale. So what does he do? He goes back to his palace, throws himself across the bed and pouts because he can't have the one thing that he wants. And sometimes we're that way. We need to be careful about how we judge Haman because the truth is we're more like him than we care to admit. We tend to forget that it's not all about us. These are Haman and Ahab and so many others and sometimes us. We forget that we think things are all about us. We have so much, yet if we're not careful, we focus on the one thing, one or two things that are lacking in our lives, or the one or two things that aren't going the way we want them to. And we'll fail to consider how blessed we are. And Haman was a lucky dude, really wasn't he? He had it good. He let that one thing, that Haman's craving for one more thing, will be his undoing. It's going to do it in. Look at verse 14. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou merrily in with the king into the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Would you say that Haman's family and friends were enablers? No. Why didn't he have just one friend say, look, just shut up with your whining, you got it good. But instead, I guess they had heard it long enough, or they just will. Sometimes people will just tell you what you want to hear. And that's what they did. They said, I'd go out and build a gallows 50 cubits high, which was about 75 feet, which is like 7 stories. Build a gallows. We're going to make an example out of Mordecai. Tomorrow morning you go in. The king has already told Mordecai he can kill all the Jews he's not going to withhold killing Mordecai from Haman. If he goes in and God doesn't intervene, Mordecai's toast in the morning. He's going to be dead. And this was not here. We tend to think in terms of what we're familiar with. Jimmy, when you think of gallows, what do you think about? A noose. That's right. You know, we think about it in those terms because we think about it in terms of the westerns that we've watched and the gallows that they build out of wood and what have you. In reality, this was most likely a sharpened stick that they would impale him on and hang him in the air to make an example out of for everybody else. So it's not a pleasant way to think about leaving this world. Um, you know, and notice the way that they said it. Said, you know, speak to the king, hang Mordecai, and then go eat lunch. No big deal. Kill him, just get rid of him. And that was that culture. They didn't think anything about it. It was not a big deal. Just kill him, be done with it. You've already got the authority. He's not going to have an issue with one more insignificant official. And you can make the case, and boy, we can sit here for a little bit. You can make the case that Mordecai deserved to die. How would you make that case? Mordecai disobeyed the king's edict. You know, they were all supposed to bow to Haman. And Mordecai didn't fight. So you could make a case. Hey, he broke the law. This is the punishment. So anyway, the night ends with the gallows being built. Not the kind that we remember. Mordecai, some speculation. You think Mordecai knew what was going on? This nighttime is kind of a, you know, I suspect, you know, you start building a gallows 75 foot high, people are going to question. You know, so there's some speculation that Mordecai know that he was building a gallows because you could certainly make the case that if Mordecai saw Haman building a gallows, there would be a lot of question about who the gallows was for. But Mordecai would know. Unless God does something, Mordecai's a dead man. Esther probably doesn't know. She's thinking about the banquet the next day, and she doesn't realize that that banquet the next day is probably going to be too late to save her poor cousin Mordecai. Chapter 6, verse 1. Let's see what happens. Because unless God does something, Mordecai's a dead man. But God comes through just in the right time and in an unusual way. Let's see how. Chapter 6, verse 1. On that night the king could not the king sleep. And he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles. They were read before the king. How many of you ever had trouble falling asleep? All of us. You know, we're in a little different setting. I say, what are some of the things you do, you know, to go to sleep? You need to read a dictionary or, you know, do this or do that. Reading will typically put me to sleep. So, Ahasuerus can't fall asleep. He's got everything at his disposal. He can ask for anything, and he asked for the books of the Chronicles to come and be read for us. And really, probably what it is he's thinking I'm going to have the most boring thing possible read to me, and that'll put me to sleep. The Chronicles were just basically the daily record. It's like reading the congressional record. Just a bunch of dull procedural things. So the book is open, and the servant begins to read. And here's what he turns to. You ever opened up your Bible? You know, I've had it happen a few times. Jackie and I be doing our devotions. You know, all right, we're going to be in Philippians chapter 3. Open up your Bible and it just falls open to Philippians chapter 3. We've all done that. It doesn't happen often. It's always kind of noteworthy for me. You know, well, look at that. You just opened up to exactly the right place. That's what happened here. The book just opened up in exactly the right place. Verse 2 of chapter 6, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, two of the king's chamberlains, keepers of the doors who sought to lay a hand on the king Ahasuerus. What are the odds of that happening? They are 100%. 100% because that's what God intended. It wasn't by chance. It wasn't like us opening it up and, you know, God orchestrated that very book and that very, there had to be many books. He grabbed just the right book and opened it up to just the right place. And it tells the story of how Mordecai had intervened and reported a plot that was designed to kill King Ahasuerus. and the king's life was spared. Look at verse 3. The king said, "What honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this?" And said the king's servant to that ministered unto him, "There is nothing done for it." Apparently it was a common thing for people, and it's just like in our society, we have civil awards, if you will, to recognize people who have done noteworthy things. They process them. I think they actually called them the king's benefactor. There was a story of one man who was given one of the king's horses, not only with one of the king's horses, but with a solid gold ring. Things like that. I mean, it was a big deal. And somehow Mordecai had missed out on being honored. Just didn't happen. You ever think about the fact that when Mordecai reported this and nothing happened, he was not honored, he was not rewarded in any way? You ever stopped and thought, well, why didn't I get something for this? Everybody else gets something for this. Would he have been wrong in thinking that? You may have thought that. We don't know. But had God allowed that to happen, however long ago it was, this would. So God was orchestrating everything all along. The other hand, the king's adamant that this is wrong. So apparently they did have some culture and some standards and some sense of decorum because the king wanted to do what was right. So he's wanting it fixed and he's wanting it fixed. Now read verse 4 and 5. The king said, "Who was in the court?" Now Haman was come to the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So this is almost funny. It's serious stuff, but this is kind of funny. Mordecai's here to talk to the king to get Mordecai killed. And the king's fixing to do something that's going to blow his socks off. Verse 5, and the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So, again, is this a coincidence? We had the book open in just the right place. Is it just a coincidence that Haman is the only one standing in the outer court? Had there been somebody else out there, Mike would have sent them. But there again, all the events happen just in such a way. The person who's come to ask Mordecai be hanged is now getting ready to do something he would rather not do. It's hard to imagine two people with more opposite objectives than the king and Haman had at this point. Verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "To whom would the king like to do more honor more than to myself?" There again, he's thinking all about me, me. Oh, he's wanting to honor me. Kind of interesting that Haman already had a list made. Didn't take him long. Well, let me think about that and get back to you. He had a list. Here's the list, and Haman answered the king, verse 7, "For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set on his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the week of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor." Haman gives him his list. He's got all these things figured out, and he's got a plan in place. One of the king's most noble princes is addressing the leaders of the city. What Haman was basically asking was to be king for the afternoon. What is that? Give me one of your old robes. Give me your horse, the horse that you rode on. And give me your crown and one of your princes to lead me throughout the city. He's not saying for me, but he's assuming it's for him. and more than just being king for the afternoon, Haman probably had the mindset, and it was probably true, that for him to have the crown put on his head and the king's robe, and the king's horse, it would have been an implication to the people of the city that Haman was Ahasuerus' successor. He was the king in waiting, if you would. Sometimes dreams crash and burn, don't they? Doesn't quite work out that way. Look at verses 10 and 11. And the king said to Haman, make haste and take apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do so even to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. The king said, you got a really great idea. You go do it. Do it all. Here you want to read between the lines that Haman fainted. That he argued. But that didn't happen in that culture. Haman had no choice but do what he was commanded to do. Then took Haman the apparel of the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the city of the city and preached through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man who the king delighteth to honor. See today, because it's the great reversal. Talk about humble. Man who's furious because Mordecai won't bow down to him is now forced back as his servant. I don't know that we can fully appreciate how humbling it was. One source said that the way that Hebrew was written indicates that Haman will actually dress Mordecai himself. He will actually be the one that wraps the robe around him. And in one place it said that Mordecai probably had to get down on all fours and Haman used his back as a step stool to climb on the horse. Ouch. That hurts. One little side note. In verse 10, the king called Mordecai the Jew. Interesting. Did the king not connect the dots? Mordecai's a Jew. He's one of those people that an edict has been issued that 11 months from now he's going to be killed. Did the king not know? I don't know that we really know, but if you go back and look at chapter 3, never once does Haman mention in chapter 3 who the people are that he's talking about putting to death. But the verse, the actual request that Haman made, he says, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. Their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. Don't know that he really even told the king who the people were that he was planning to put to death. And certainly if he did, Ahasuerus didn't connect the dots there because he calls Mordecai the Jew. No record that king even asked. Apparently he just trusted Haman, gave him the ring to seal the edict. Life was so cheap that he just didn't care. Let's see how the day ends. We'll read verses 12 and 14 and wrap it up. Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his horse, to his house mourning, having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. While they were yet talking to him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman into the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the end of the tour through the city, notice what Mordecai does. Mordecai went back to his place of duty. He went back to sitting in the king's gate, serving and doing his job. Mordecai covers his head and limps home, not wanting to be seen. You see those purple walks, the people got these under, things over their head. They don't want to be recognized. He just want to be recognized. So he goes home and he tells his wife and his friends what's happened to him. And now instead of being supportive and saying you do what you want to do, they're basically saying, dude, you're toast. You're not going to, if Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, and you've started to fall before him, it's going to happen. You're going to fall before him. And in a scene that we probably can't really imagine, says the king's chamberlains arrive. It's almost like the limo pulls up to take him back to the king's banquet, which we'll find out next week will be his last meal. How could it possibly get any worse, right? So what can we take away from today's lesson? For us, it's a great story. I enjoy telling it. I enjoy reading about it because of all the things we talked about before. We made it through 6 of the 10 chapters of Esther. And as we mentioned before, God's not mentioned anywhere in the book. He's not mentioned. But you can sure see his hand moving in the story. Things for the Jews, God's people seem pretty bleak. In 11 months, they're going to be dead. Nothing changes because they didn't see it. You ever get the feeling now, especially recently since about March, that things look pretty bleak in our world sometimes? It's probably good we don't know everything, because we probably be more worried about it than we are. Things are happening in our own country that one time, not that long ago, we could never even imagine. We would have said it would not be possible. It's easy to think things are out of control. I think maybe Esther and Haman and Mordecai felt that way. When things are out of control, we've got this madman and he's going to kill us. And what in the world we're going to do? It's easy for us to wonder sometimes where God is. We don't hear God spoken of in the public near as much as we want to see it. And now, when people do speak about it, they're typically really cool. And in some cases, with our own vice president, now people think he's unfit to be vice president because of his spiritual beliefs. You wonder sometimes why it seems like God is allowing the enemy to prevail. Here's what we need to remember. God works when circumstances are uncontrollable. You realize how little we are in control? People control nothing. And when you're a control freak like me, that's very troubling. I'm a control freak. I won't be. Am I not? Yes, it is. I'm a control freak. When I can't control the circumstances, I get nervous. God's at work. We don't have to control the circumstances. God's at work when life seems unpredictable. It's always unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen the rest of the day. God's at work when sin seems unstoppable. In our world today, it seems like sin is unstoppable. God hadn't quit working. He's not uninterested. He's not uninvolved, and he's not unconcerned. Matthew 10 is a good reminder. It says this, "Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye have more value than many sparrows." Psalm 121:4 reminds us, "Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." The name of God's not mentioned in the story, but yet he's not asleep. He's not inactive. He hasn't quit being involved. He's still working. What we saw on display wasn't just a bunch of circumstances. Was it a coincidence that the king couldn't sleep? Was it a coincidence that his servant just happened to grab that one book and then opened it up to the one page? Not a coincidence. There's nothing in the situation that was by chance. There's a classic example of Psalm 21:1 in action. Says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will." Chris and Mr. Gordon will remember we talked about Wednesday just briefly. I told Gordon what I was going to share in the class today. He said, "Good, now I don't have to come." So, anyway, I read this in a sermon. It says, "All the pieces on the chessboard belong to God. He can move a king just as easily as he can move a pawn. He can move a queen into place, as we saw in the story of Esther, just as easily as he can move a bishop. It's all his." We close this morning with this reassurance. God never slumbers or sleeps. If you have trouble sleeping, he's awake. When you drift off to sleep, he doesn't. He works on it. Because he's never tired, you can't be tired. Because God never sleeps, you can. You don't have to be in control of circumstances or people. God already is. Why do we want so badly to be in control when God doesn't so much better than we do? Our human nature. Let's close in prayer. Father, we love you. We thank you for your word. Thank you for this story that even though you're not mentioned in the whole book of the Bible that we're studying, it's clear that you're working and that you're in control. and that you have your hands on circumstances and people's heart that don't even know and wouldn't even acknowledge you. Lord, you're in control. I pray that you will help us this morning to take comfort in that. I pray that you will help us to trust you, even when the circumstances aren't the way we'd like for them to be, Lord, that you will just help us to trust you and know that you do things for our benefit, and even when the things don't seem good at the time, that you're working and you never do things to hurt us. Lord, thank you for these good people that are here in the class and for those who are watching online. Lord, just thank you for them and the fellowship that we have with them and the care and the fact that they're brothers and sisters in Christ. And we take comfort in that. We just pray that you bless us now as we go into our church service and we'll speak to our hearts today. For it's in Jesus'